Well, everyone wants to do something about the drug problem, but the death penalty doesn't work. As we've seen, it doesn't work in Malaysia, where they apply it ruthlessly. And in fact, it hasn't worked since the dawn of recorded history.
Well, the Malaysians would say that it works only in one respect. They don't have the big pushers in there. Mrs. Barlow was right. The big pushers who can afford it make their headquarters in other countries. What it does mean is that they simply send in little guys who will do anything for the money.
And they're the ones who take the fall. And where's the justice in that? If the death penalty worked, if you have no scruples about it on moral grounds or religious grounds, then perhaps it's one way to deal with it. But we've seen in this country for heinous crimes like murder and rape and other heinous crimes, it hasn't worked. And so it's really problematical that it would work in drug cases.
Yeah, but the Malaysians would say this is not a question of scruples. Their country is under an invasion. They sit at the foot of an avalanche of opium from the Golden Triangle. And if you were under invasion by an army, you'd counterattack.
Yes, but you'd use, I hope, what's effective and not just what makes you feel good. Well, consider these statistics from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The overall number of Americans using drugs is falling from 23 million in 1985 to 14.5 million in 1988. But the number of people who use cocaine every day has nearly doubled from 240,000 to 400,000. Before today's summit, Colombia was pointing the finger.
We perceive the U.S. as being the responsible for this drug traffic. We say that if there was no demand, there would be no supply.
This when Primetime continues.
Colombia and the violence in our own streets. It's a problem that starts there and ends here, or so we think. But Colombians say their deadly drug cartels would be out of business if it weren't for us. $14,000. That's how much this accused cocaine trafficker has already cost taxpayers, and she hasn't even gone to trial yet. When Primetime continues, after this from our ABC stations. New York, Primetime continues.
Presidential candidate Senator Louis Galan was shot down.
Colombia has declared his country under a state of siege, all because of his...
There was action against the drug dealers today.
A telephone caller claimed that the plane was blown up by drug dealers.
Given the headlines, it's easy for Americans to think of Colombia as the main problem, a country that cannot control the violence or the flow of cocaine. But here in Colombia, there is a different perspective.
We perceive the U.S. as being the responsible for this drug traffic. We say that if there was no demand, there would be no supply.
Juan Manuel Santos, whose family newspaper El Tiempo is Colombia's most widely read newspaper, reflects the prevailing view here. The view that it is the cocaine users in the United States, who spend $60 billion annually on their habit, who keep the drug lords in business. And whenever Colombians can spotlight that use, as when the mayor of Washington, D.C. was charged with cocaine possession, they do so gleefully. Well, now, the day after Mayor Barry was busted, you put him on the front page here.
Oh, yes.
Why?
Well, because this is it was tremendous news. This is a demonstration that the problem is not ours. The problem is mainly in the United States.
Not only is it Americans who use the cocaine, Colombians further complain that it is American companies which help make the cocaine. To process the coca leaves in jungle laboratories requires a huge volume of chemicals, and those chemicals have been coming from the United States. Among them, kerosene, sulfuric acid, acetone, ether, and methylethyl ketone, MEK for short. Such compounds are used in legitimate enterprises in Colombia, but not in the quantity being imported into the country. Consider MEK, a popular solvent that the drug lords favor as a means for extracting the pure cocaine from coca paste. MEK is used by the petroleum industry in the manufacture of paints and varnishes and in making adhesives, all legitimate uses. But, says the head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration Chemical Section, Gene Hazlip,
none of them, if you put them all together, could ever account for the quantity of that chemical that is being imported into Colombia from the United States and from Europe. It's far in excess perhaps 40%, maybe 70% in excess of any legitimate need that we can identify.
Of course, no U.S. chemical company sells directly to the drug lords. Exxon, for instance, which sells almost half the MEK shipped into Colombia, says it works hard to make certain there is no illegal diversion. But does it succeed? Exxon's John Rutledge, head of its Latin American division.
We're quite confident, Sam, that the product that we export is not being diverted to illegal end uses. And if we thought that any of it was, if there was a suspicion of it, we'd cut sales of that product off to those customers immediately.
And what does the DEA say? So if someone tells you that none is going to process cocaine?
Well, I don't believe that, and in fact, it's impossible and just cannot be the case. I think if people think none of their product is, well, that's a different kind of statement, but even that's very difficult to accept on the record.
The DEA is now armed with a new law that allows it to check U.S. chemical sales right down to the final user and cut off suspected users. But the drug lords are still obtaining chemicals. If Colombians view the United States as being responsible for the illegal drug trade, they now also view the United States as increasingly responsible for putting a damper on Colombia's legal trade. Take coffee, the country's #1 legal export. Last July, the U.S. and other consuming nations abandoned the World Coffee Trade Agreement for reasons of price fairness, they say. But the effect was to send Colombia's coffee price plummeting. Then there's cut flowers, Colombia's #3 legal export after petroleum. Carnations mainly, which come through the Miami airport by the boxload daily, where they are checked for hidden cocaine pouches. Last December, Washington announced an intent to slap on a stiff anti-dumping tariff, which would drastically reduce Colombian flower sales. These two actions, in coffee and flowers, would cost Colombia $600 million annually. The effect that would have on the drug war could be disastrous, according to Colombia Cut Flower Association's Jorge Ribe.
If you limit the possibilities of people getting engaged into legitimate businesses, what do you expect from the unemployment rates coming up, and what do you expect from people living out of if they have alternatives like the drug business?
If we tell these people to grow coffee, to grow flowers, to grow soybean, and they don't have a market.
Representative Charles Rangel, chairman of the U.S. House Narcotics Select Committee, says Colombia's economic complaints must be acted on.
When you're dealing with an ally and a friend in a war, you don't retaliate the same way that you would with some other country. It's as simple as that.
Finally, there is the touchy subject of how to deal with the drug lords themselves. How to deal with people like Pablo Escobar, the head of the Medellin drug cartel. Many Colombians disagree with their own government's cooperation with the U.S. push to extradite the drug lords to the United States for trial. 49% of the Colombian public favors negotiation with the drug lords. 59% favors amnesty for those who give themselves up. Among those who oppose extradition is the mayor of Medellin, Juan Gomez.
Nos están matando por la extradición.
We are being killed over extradition, says Gomez. It's a factor that causes violence. So let's bring them to trial in Colombia.
Y juzguémoslos en Colombia.
And when you ask about Pablo Escobar in Medellin, you often get an ambivalent answer. What do you think of Pablo Escobar?
Pablo Escobar? Well, he knows his job. He knows what he's doing. But, I personally don't agree what this is doing,
To understand the ambivalence Medellin feels toward the drug lords, you have to come here, to Barrio Pablo. In 1983, Pablo Escobar built this low-rent housing project for the poor. Elsewhere, he built soccer stadiums, and off on an opening day, he would show up and play with the youngsters. He subsidized schools and parks and gave to various charities. So while we may see Pablo Escobar as nothing but a narco-murderer, to many people in Medellin, he is a local hero. It is against this background of internal division that Colombia's President Barco called today's summit, hoping at the very least to get this show of solidarity for his get tough policy, if he came away with nothing else. And what you're looking at now is President Bush, who has just arrived a moment ago at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington after a flight from Barranquilla in Colombia. His Air Force jet having landed at Barranquilla and then helicoptering, of course, to Cartagena, where the summit was held.
The president, of course, proclaimed it the dawn of a new era, as we said before. Any word on what the Colombians thought?
Well, yes, we do. You'll remember that we had Juan Manuel Santos, who was an editor of El Tiempo, Colombia's largest newspaper, in the report we just showed. And this is what they're going to say, El Tiempo, tomorrow morning about this summit. Santos has written that it was semi-successful. Sounds like reporters everywhere. That it was important that there was no security incident, that the president, all of them, were safe. And that the big component of that summit was public relations. Again, any one of us could have written that.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, watching your piece, I kept thinking back to something in our poll we took a few days ago that struck me as particularly poignant. The Colombians, sitting in the middle of the bombs and the execution and the constant threat, the majority of them thought they were winning the war on drugs. The majority of Americans, with the relative insulation we have up here, thought they were losing the war on drugs.
That's why we wanted to show that different perspective.